The most important moment in a tired garden may not happen in the garden at all. It may happen at a kitchen sink when a bowl of rice is rinsed under cold water and the clear water turns cloudy in a few seconds. Most people do not stop at that moment. They swirl the grains with their fingers, watch the starch lift from the surface, and pour the pale liquid straight down the drain. It looks like nothing useful. It looks like water that has already done its job. But outside, in a dry garden bed, the soil may be waiting for exactly that kind of mistake. A bed that looks dead rarely announces what is wrong with it. It does not always crack open dramatically or turn white with salt. Sometimes it simply becomes quiet. Water sits on the surface instead of sinking in. Seeds germinate slowly, then stall. Leaves grow pale even when the plant is watered. When the gardener digs a few inches down, there are no worms, no earthy smell, and no softness in the soil. The ground is still there, but the life inside it has slowed almost to silence. That is why the phrase dead soil is so powerful, even when it is not technically precise. Soil is not dead in the same way a broken branch is dead. In many cases, it is more like a village after the wells have dried and the markets have closed. The structure remains, but the movement has stopped. The mistake many gardeners make is assuming that silence means the soil only needs fertilizer, so they add more nutrients, a stronger blend, a brighter bottle, a faster promise, and sometimes the plants respond for a moment because soluble nutrients can push growth quickly. But if the soil biology remains inactive, the improvement does not last. The plant may grow new leaves, then stall again. The surface may stay compacted. Water may continue to run away from the roots. The garden remains dependent on the next external push. Rice water belongs to a different kind of logic. It is not powerful because it contains every nutrient a plant needs. It does not replace compost, mulch, minerals, or good soil structure. It is not a miracle liquid that turns lifeless dirt into black earth overnight. Its value is simpler and more interesting. Rice water feeds the organisms that make soil function. When rice is rinsed, the cloudy water carries starches, small soluble residues, and traces of nutrients from the surface of the grain. To a plant, that liquid is mild. To microbes, it is easy food. Bacteria and fungi do not need a perfect fertilizer label. They need carbon, moisture, and a reason to multiply. That is where the story begins. Because plants do not feed from soil alone. They feed through a living system around their roots. In that narrow underground zone, microbes break down organic matter, release enzymes, dissolve minerals, and exchange nutrients with roots in ways that no bottle can fully imitate. If that microbial system goes quiet, the plant can stand in soil full of potential and still starve. The pantry is not empty. The workers are gone. Rice water helps because it speaks to the workers first. Fresh rice rinse water can be used as a mild soil feed, but the deeper version of the method begins when the liquid is allowed to sit. Over time, wild microorganisms begin to change it. The smell shifts slightly. The starches become food. The liquid becomes more than cloudy water. It becomes the beginning of a microbial culture. This is why the method appears again and again in natural farming traditions. It is cheap, local, and almost impossible to make impressive at first glance. There is no dramatic ingredient, no rare mineral, no secret imported powder. Just rice, water, time, and the invisible life that arrives when those three things meet. That simplicity is exactly why the method is easy to dismiss. A gardener can believe in a bag of fertilizer because the numbers are printed clearly on the front. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, measured, packaged, and ready to apply. But rice water does not work through that kind of authority. It works through a chain reaction. First, the liquid feeds microbes. Then microbes begin changing the soil environment. Then roots encounter a more active rhizosphere. Then worms and other soil organisms may return if moisture, food, and shelter are present. Finally, the plant begins to grow in a system that is waking up around it, not simply being forced from above. That is why the real question is not whether rice water is fertilizer. The better question is whether a soil that has gone quiet can be encouraged to breathe again, and to understand why such a simple liquid became part of a serious farming method. We have to leave the kitchen sink and look at the agricultural tradition that learned to culture life from the materials everyone else ignored. Because the cloudy water in that bowl is only the first stage. The real transformation begins when fermentation takes over. The deeper version of the rice water method does not begin when the water is poured onto soil. It begins before that, while the liquid is still sitting quietly in a jar. At first, there is nothing impressive about it. The water looks pale, cloudy, and ordinary with a thin layer of starch suspended inside it. But once it is left loosely covered at room temperature, the liquid begins to attract and feed microorganisms already present in the environment. Some arrive from the rice itself. Some come from the air. Some are already living on the surface of the container. What matters is that the rice water gives them something easy to consume. The starches and soluble residues in the water become a first meal, and as the microbes begin feeding, the chemistry of the liquid slowly changes. The smell becomes slightly sour. The surface may show faint activity. The liquid no longer behaves like plain rinse water. It becomes the early stage of a microbial culture. This is where the method connects to Korean natural farming. Korean natural farming is built around one central idea. Fertile soil is not created only by adding nutrients from outside, but by strengthening the living organisms already adapted to the local environment. Instead of treating the soil as an empty container that must be filled with purchased inputs, the method treats soil as a living system that can be guided, multiplied, and restored. One of the best-known inputs in that tradition is lactic acid bacteria, often shortened to LAB. The process usually begins with rice wash water. The cloudy liquid is left for several days so early microbial activity can begin. Then milk is added, creating conditions where lactic acid bacteria can become dominant. Over time, the mixture separates into curds and a yellowish liquid, and that liquid is the LAB serum gardeners and natural farmers use after heavy dilution. The important part is not that the method looks dramatic. The important part is what it teaches. Rice water is not valuable because it is a balanced fertilizer. It is valuable because it becomes a doorway into microbial farming. It gives the grower a simple way to collect, feed, and multiply organisms that can influence decomposition, odor control, nutrient cycling, and the biological activity around roots. This is why the internet version of the method often becomes confusing. Some people hear about rice water and imagine it as a direct plant food, almost like a cheap liquid fertilizer. Others hear about LAB and describe it as if it can resurrect any soil in a few days. Both versions miss the quieter truth. The real effect is not instant resurrection. It is biological momentum. A soil that has been compacted, overheated, overwatered, or starved of organic matter can lose the small processes that make it feel alive. Plant residues break down slowly. The surface becomes crusted. Roots struggle to explore. Worms disappear because there is not enough microbial activity, moisture, or soft organic material to support them. When diluted, fermented rice water enters that kind of soil, it does not rebuild everything by itself. What it can do is give the microbial community a push, especially when the gardener also provides moisture, mulch, and organic matter. The liquid brings food. The fermentation brings microbial activity. The soil receives a signal that decomposition can begin again. That is why the method works best when it is not used alone. A gardener who pours rice water onto dry, bare, compacted ground and walks away may see very little. But a gardener who loosens the surface, adds mulch, keeps the soil lightly moist, and then applies diluted fermented rice water is doing something very different. They are not feeding dirt. They are rebuilding habitat. This distinction matters because soil organisms do not live on nutrients alone. They need moisture, air, organic matter, and protection from extreme heat. Without those conditions, even a good microbial input has nowhere to settle. But when the conditions are right, the changes can become visible. The soil may begin to smell less dusty and more earthy. Water may soak in more easily. Mulch may soften faster. Tiny white fungal threads may appear beneath decaying leaves. And eventually, if the bed has enough organic matter and moisture, earthworms may return. Worms are often treated as the proof that a garden is healthy, but they are not the first step. They usually arrive after the invisible work has already started. They follow the food chain created by microbes, decaying material, and softened soil structure. In this sense, rice water does not create worms. It helps restart the conditions that make worms want to live there. That is a much more honest claim, and it is also more interesting, because it means the rice water method is not about forcing life into dead ground. It is about giving the smallest organisms enough energy to restart the chain that larger organisms depend on. This is also why the method remained mostly outside mainstream agriculture. A commercial fertilizer can be measured, sealed, stored, shipped, and applied with predictable nutrient numbers. A homemade microbial culture is different. It changes with temperature, water quality, rice type, fermentation time, and local microorganisms. It belongs more to practice than to product. That does not make it useless. It simply means it does not fit easily into systems built around standardized inputs. And once that becomes clear, the story stops sounding like a secret and begins to sound like something older. A low-cost biological method that survived because gardeners could make it themselves, from a material almost everyone had already been throwing away. But before this method can be useful, it has to be used carefully, because the same starches that feed helpful microbes can also sour, attract pests, or create imbalance when used too strongly. And that is where the final part of the story begins. Not with the promise that rice water fixes everything, but with the practical question every gardener should ask before pouring it into the soil. How much life is already there, and how gently does it need to be woken? The most common mistake with rice water is treating it as if more of it must be better. That mistake makes sense at first. If a little fermented rice water feeds microbes, then a strong dose should wake the soil faster. If a cloudy liquid contains starches and biological activity, then pouring it generously around every plant might seem like the easiest way to bring a weak garden back. But soil biology rarely responds well to force. The same material that can gently feed microbial life can also create problems when used too heavily. Too much starch in a wet soil can turn sour. A thick, undiluted liquid can encourage mold on the surface, attract insects, or create anaerobic pockets where the soil smells unpleasant instead of earthy. This is why the rice water method works best when it is used as a signal, not as a flood. For the simplest version, plain rice is rinsed in water until the liquid turns cloudy, and that water is collected instead of poured down the drain. It can be used fresh as a mild soil feed, or it can be left for a short fermentation period until the smell becomes lightly sour but not rotten. The stronger natural farming version goes further, using rice wash water as the first stage for collecting lactic acid bacteria. Then adding milk so the culture separates and the useful serum can be collected. But in both cases, the most important step comes after fermentation: dilution. A small amount of fermented rice water or LAB serum should be mixed into a much larger volume of clean water before it reaches the soil. The liquid should be applied around the root zone, not sprayed over leaves in the heat, and not poured repeatedly into already wet, compacted ground. The goal is to encourage microbial activity without overwhelming the conditions that allow healthy microbes to survive. Rice water also works best when it has something to work with. If the soil is completely bare, dry, and exposed to sun, the microbial pulse may fade quickly. But if the ground is covered with mulch, kept lightly moist, and given organic matter to decompose, the rice water input becomes part of a larger recovery process. The starch feeds microbes. The microbes begin working through organic matter. Organic matter improves the texture of the soil. Softer soil holds moisture more evenly. Roots explore more easily, and worms may return when the environment becomes worth returning to. That is the chain. Not instant resurrection, but biological sequence. This is also why the phrase dead soil can mislead gardeners. Truly poisoned or contaminated soil cannot be repaired by rice water alone. Soil with no organic matter, no moisture, and no protection from heat will not become fertile simply because one cloudy liquid touched it. But much of what gardeners call dead soil is not truly dead. It is tired. It is compacted. It is underfed biologically. It has lost the rhythm that allows microbes, roots, fungi, and worms to work together. In those conditions, rice water can become a useful beginning because it does not try to replace the whole system. It simply restarts one small part of it. And sometimes one small part is enough to change the direction of the whole bed. The first sign may not be the plant suddenly growing taller. It may be something quieter. Water begins to disappear into the soil instead of sitting on top. The surface becomes less crusted after watering. Mulch breaks down faster. When the gardener digs with a hand tool, the soil no longer feels like dead powder or sealed clay. Then the roots respond. A seedling holds itself more firmly. A transplant stops wilting by afternoon. A plant that had stalled begins forming new leaves from the growing tip. This is the kind of recovery that matters because it shows the soil system is beginning to function again. And this also explains why rice water never became a major industrial fertilizer story. It is too simple, too variable, and too local. A commercial fertilizer can be tested, labeled, sealed, shipped, and sold with the same numbers printed on every bag. Rice water changes from one kitchen to another. Fermentation changes with temperature, water quality, time, and the organisms present in the environment. It is difficult to standardize. It is difficult to store. It is difficult to turn into a product that performs the same way everywhere. So the method stayed mostly in homes, small farms, natural farming circles, and garden conversations passed from one person to another. Not because it was useless, and not because it was a miracle being hidden from the world, but because it belonged to a different kind of agriculture. An agriculture based less on buying a finished input and more on understanding a living process. That is the deeper lesson behind the rice water method. It reminds the gardener that fertility is not only a list of nutrients, it is movement. It is decomposition. It is the quiet exchange between roots and microbes. It is the return of organic matter into forms that plants can use again. Rice water is only one small tool inside that system. It cannot replace compost. It cannot replace mulch. It cannot replace balanced minerals, good drainage, or careful watering. But it can help start the conversation again when the soil has gone silent. And that is why the bowl at the kitchen sink begins to look different. The cloudy water that once seemed like waste is not powerful because rice is rare. It is powerful because it carries an easy food source for the smallest workers in the soil. It gives them a reason to multiply, and once they begin moving, the rest of the underground system can begin moving with them. So the next time rice is rinsed and the water turns pale in the bowl, it may be worth pausing before pouring it away. Somewhere outside, there may be a bed that looks finished. A place where water no longer sinks, where roots struggle, where worms have disappeared, and where the soil seems to have forgotten how to breathe. And perhaps the first step is not another bag, another bottle, or another promise printed on a label. Perhaps the first step is only a small, cloudy liquid from the kitchen, diluted carefully and returned to the ground with mulch, moisture, and patience. Because what looks like waste in the sink may be the first signal that the soil is ready to breathe again.